backwards in time to seek out the identity of those who penned the Bible's first immortal words. Almost 1,000 years ago, it was first noticed that there were seemingly contradictory passages in the text of the first 5 books of Moses. Many words were ascribed to Moses, but unlikely to have been written by him. Scholars have argued that if Moses was the author of the book of Deuteronomy, how could it have been possible for him to have written about his own death?
The problem of how Moses could have been the one who recorded and passed on the Torah, and then it turns out to describe his own death, was already raised by the sages, and they simply answered by giving 2 possibilities. One, that Moses did indeed write of his own death while crying as he wrote. And second of all, that those verses of the Torah were written by his faithful servant and his successor, Joshua.
But there were even more puzzling sections in the texts, some of them as early as the book of Genesis.
And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female. Genesis 6:19.
That excerpt is from the story of Noah and the flood. Just a few sentences farther, there is this surprising discrepancy, quoting a different number of animals to be taken into the ark.
Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by 7s, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean by 2, the male and his female. Genesis 7:2.
Was it 2 of each kind of animal, or 7 of each clean animal? The texts contain other oddities. There are numerous examples of the same story told twice, sometimes with conflicting details. Scholars have long referred to these as doublets. There are 2 separate accounts of the creation of the world, 2 versions of the covenant made between God and the patriarch Abraham, and even 2 distinct versions of Moses obtaining water from a rock at a place called Meribah during the Exodus. In most instances of these so-called doublets, the 2 versions of the story each referred to God by a different name. In the Hebrew text, sometimes the deity is referred to as Elohim, the usual Hebrew reference to God. But in the alternative version, the term used is often Yahweh, or Lord. For centuries, scholars have puzzled over the appearance of these distinct differences.
The key piece of evidence in this is that different kinds of clues converged with each other, so that you have doublets of stories, that proves nothing. You have different names of God, that proves nothing. But when all the doublets of stories line up into 2 groups, one of which uses one name of God and one uses the other name of God consistently, then that's strong evidence that something is going on.
By the early half of the 19th century, many scholars were convinced that the 5 books of Moses were written by 3 separate authors. The writer of the version which referred to God as Yahweh was named J, because early European translators were ignorant of the correct pronunciation of Hebrew names. Many inadvertently referred to the name of God as Jehovah instead of Yahweh, and ironically, the name has stuck. The author of those texts referring to God as Elohim was named E. A third writer was identified as P. This author was thought to be a priest and wrote in a different style to J and E. His passages seem to be especially concerned with stories of the establishment of the priesthood after the people of Israel left Egypt. The differences are immediately obvious in Hebrew, the language in which the text was originally written. The disparities virtually disappear in their English translation, but this example comes from the book of Exodus. The text relates how God appears to Moses in a burning bush. The passage was written by J, who in Hebrew refers to God as Yahweh or Lord. When the E writer discusses Moses confronting the burning bush, the name used for the deity is now only Elohim, God.
Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Exodus 3:6.
Subtle though the differences may be, the texts clearly seem to reflect a compilation of sources. In 1807, the German theologian Wilhelm de Wet announced the discovery of a possible fourth author. His examination of the text indicated that the language, tone, and content of the entire book of Deuteronomy were the work of a different person to J, E, or P. Scholars have since come to refer to this writer by the name D, for Deuteronomist. Over the years, the authorship theory has come to be known as the documentary hypothesis.
Once you've identified a text and said, well, I think this is J, or I think this is E, I think this is P, I think this is D, then you place it up against other texts in the Bible where we have some idea of the date and see if there's any development in the language. It's not just that you can tell the difference between the way I speak English and the way Shakespeare did. It's that if you heard somebody who lived in the 18th century, you could tell that that person was somewhere halfway between Shakespeare and me. So you can see the stages of biblical Hebrew in growth.
In a stunning retraction of early church intolerance toward the hypothesis and the issue of biblical authorship, in 1943, Pope Pius XII surprises religious leaders and academics alike by issuing a new edict. He encourages scholars to fully investigate the question, who wrote the Bible?
To his disciples and said, take this, all of you, and drink from it.
The directive was heralded as a Magna Carta for biblical study, initiating unprecedented research into the origins of the Holy Book. The quest would open up a fascinating window on how the sacred words of the divine have traversed the centuries. When we come back, an unexpected discovery brings us face to face with what may be the actual identity of one of the earliest writers of the 5 books of Moses. The Bible is the central pillar upon which much of Western civilization has been built. For untold centuries, it has served as one of humanity's principal guiding beacons. Yet its very origins are now being called into question. The search for answers concerning its authorship may seem circuitous, but it will bring us into direct contact with the signature of a man who may have written at least one of the 5 books of Moses. Our quest must go back some 35 centuries, to the time when the people of Israel approached the borders of the Promised Land. After decades of wandering, the Hebrews eventually crossed the River Jordan and settled in Canaan. While the 10 Commandments were constantly in the possession of the people, there may have been no other religious texts at the time. Though the Bible indicates that the scrolls of Moses may have accompanied the Israelites, many scholars believe that the first 5 books of the Bible had not yet been written. After the advent of the monarchy, in about 1000 before the Common Era, King David eventually becomes ruler and establishes his new capital at Jerusalem. It is then that the matter of authorship re-enters the story.